Metroid Zero Missions is 20th anniversary is this month, so I expect it's gonna get re-released on Game Boy Advance Online soon, and I'll replay it for sure. I did so recently, I think last year or the year before that. It wasn't that long ago, but I had a blast playing Zero Mission like the last time I played it, and I would love to play it again. I've been eagerly awaiting it, and I do think it's a good thing that this game is reaching a new audience because this is the first Metroid game chronologically. It's the one where Samus goes to Zebes and she fights the Metroids for the first time and confronts Mother Brain. And I think Zero Mission does a lot to alleviate the problems with the original Metroid game, right? Like it feels a lot more like Super. The animations are smooth. The visual style is better. It has all these good animations, great boss fights, great moments in general. Like Zero Mission, I think is very very underappreciated. Like when I see people mention Zero Mission, a lot of times it's like hardcore fans of the original who will try and like deride the game for being easier and like say it completely ruined the experience. But for me, like I've played Zero Mission several times, right? Like I've always been a big major advocate for Zero Mission, right? Like it's so weird to me seeing people like try to talk down about it and Samus Returns when both of those games are just spectacular, right? Like I love both of those games. And the fact that so many people like try to talk down about them, I think it really just goes to demonstrate just how little respect that so-called hardcore Metroid fans actually can have for the franchise, right? Like, you're really going to downplay Zero Mission and Samus Returns, really? Like remakes of the first two games in the series, ones that really innovated and added a lot to the franchise. Like I remember Maelstrom like complaining about like the counter mechanic in Samus Returns. I remember a lot of people doing that actually. Like, oh, Samus wouldn't do that, blah blah blah. And then like in Dread, she is, right? Like it's a standard part of her moveset now. Like it's kind of a common thing for her to do that. Like what exactly what exactly is so weird about Samus like using a counter mechanic? But again, it really just goes to show you just how these guys, like people like Movie Bob, people like Sean Malmstrom, like they get it in their heads that like characters need to look and act a certain way, and then they get upset when like any of that changes, right? You'll see Sean Malmstrom to this day, like he'll complain like whenever like something bad goes wrong for Nintendo, like every single time it's the 3D. Like, oh, the evil 3D is ruining our video games. That's why the DS didn't do very well. It's because of the 3D. Keep in mind, like the DS is the second best selling console ever made. Like that's why the DS didn't do well because of the 3D. Like it was like the stupidest thing, right? It was such a weird narrative, right? Like seeing these people like try and find things to complain about with Zero Mission, with Samus Returns, and I think with by extension, like the Prime games as well, because I remember Prime 2 and 3 in particular getting slammed. So like the way it looks to me is that like the only Metroid games you're allowed to like generally are Super and Prime. Like everything else is just like weirdly controversial for some reason. Like, oh, the first two haven't aged well. Oh, the remakes aren't good. Oh, Fusion is linear. Oh, Prime is not a real Metroid game. Oh, two is boring and tedious. Oh, three is basically just a Halo clone. Oh, it's such a weird thing like seeing this play out, and I do think this is something we really need to acknowledge going forward because this is something I talked about in my top 10 most downplayed Nintendo games video. Not enough, I'm afraid to say, but like Samus Returns like really should have been celebrated more than what it ended up being, because when that game came out all anybody could do was just like, oh, the fan made remake was way better. Like for an entire couple of years we had to deal with that, and slowly the Samus Return started building up like an actual genuine fan base. And then like Dread came out, and then like that kind of marked the return of Samus, right? But like we went through this really big drag spell where like people were begging for new Metroid games, begging for new 2D Samus games, right? like like and then we finally got one, and like everybody just like tried attacking it, right? Like it was crazy to see that happen, right? Like and I remember like growing up, like one of the reasons I never bought Metroid Fusion growing up is that I was told the game isn't good, it's not that memorable, it's a step down from Super, you should like play something else. And like I put that off for like years I didn't play Metroid Fusion until like 2014 or so, like after the Wii U, right? I played the game and I'm kind of shocked that like, wait a minute, this game is actually good. Like really? Like it's weird to think back on now, but the anti like the narrative for Metroid, like people really do pretend as if all of these games that come out are like not up to their standards, but in reality they're fantastic, right? Like they always have been. And I find it so remarkable how this keeps happening consistently across like all of these different Nintendo properties, right? Like, how many people like tried to complain about F-Zero 99 when it got announced? How many people tried to complain about Super Mario Bros. Wonder or Tears of the Kingdom or like Pokemon, right? Like, how many people are like trying to gaslight you into thinking these games are somehow lesser than previous games in the series? Like the reality is these people don't know what they're talking about, and that is something that I really would like to strongly emphasize going forward is that like Zero Mission was not all that well received when it came out, right? Zero Mission, the game that everyone is talking about, like, oh man, I love this growing up. Like, this was a game that was very derided and downplayed when it was first released, right? Like, this was not something that a lot of people acknowledged as being particularly great. And it's such a shame to see because Metroid, I think, more than any other Nintendo franchise, tends to have this very, very dedicated following of people who will like go back and play the older games. At least up to Super, I think. Like they do really well in like the post market, right? People love them, and it's so sad to see just how many people just love writing off like Zero Mission, love writing off Fusion. When like really that was like I think the moment where Metroid really started growing as a brand, right? Like they peaked with Super, right? And then they started like innovating and doing other things. They put out Metroid Prime, they put out Fusion, they put out Zero Mission, the remake, and then they, stuff like Federation Force, which were really cool experimental titles for the brand. Like I love Metroid. I always have. I've always been a big advocate for it. But like, it really needs to be said that the people who like claim to be big Metroid fans, like they're not turning out for the games, right? Like, how long did it take for people to start acknowledging that Dread was legit great, right? Like, how long did it take people to do that? Like, and even now, it feels like kind of weird how people don't really remember Metroid Prime 2 or 3 that much, let alone something like Hunters or Prime Pinball, right? The reality is that, like a lot of Nintendo games, Metroid is highly disrespected, right? Like, and we as gamers, we as Nintendo fans, really need to do everything in our power to stop this going forward.